Okay, so I was thinking about this yesterday and preparing for what I might say, and I thought, well, I'll have a look at some of the Watkins talks that have preceded this, and of course, one that leapt out at me was Eckhart Tolle. I think it was about eight years ago that he gave one of these talks, and rather affectionately was talking about the bookshop as a place where he'd found the sort of teachings I'm going to talk about today, and that effect on his life of some of those teachings. And one of the effects was to do with thought and to do with mind. And in his talk, he was talking about the fact that he said probably about 80% less thoughts, 80% less activity in the mind than he had before his shift in consciousness. And if some of you don't know the story, he was an academic who had a very significant breakdown, ended up homeless on the streets of London, suicidal, and until he had the thought, I can't live with myself anymore, and then wondered what that meant in terms of who's the self that he can't live with anymore. And that led to, as we now know, an extraordinary raft of teachings that he's now passed on. But the whole thing about thought is really interesting. And one of the things that most mystics will agree on is that the power of thought to interrupt life or the process of living or a spiritual connection or a connection of any sort to ourselves and to the natural world is profound. And I had an example fairly recently. So I'm a psychotherapist in the NHS, and I also teach mindfulness in the NHS. And there was a member of the group who had been in another group, a colleagues' mindfulness group. So I said to her, well, what do you think you've learned so far from mindfulness? And she said, well, I now know I'm not my thoughts. So I said, well, that's interesting. And she said, yes, and it's liberating because, and this is a woman who'd had over 20 years of chronic depression, including psychotic depression. And her thoughts, particularly in depressive episodes, were very critical and very debilitating, judging of herself. Sort of thing where she might say, you're a failure, you're useless, you're unlovable, you're unacceptable. The sort of thing that is quite common in depressive thinking. So thought, and this is where we come to golf and other sports perhaps, thought is something that can interrupt the natural flow of being, and in this sense, playing the game. So when we talk about no one playing, we're talking about the absence of that thought. Absence of the I thought. So just to give you a little bit of background to the book, this is something that I started 30 years ago, and probably completed about a third to a half of it back then. And then there was a long fallow period, and in lockdown there came an opportunity to finish the book. And not just an opportunity, but I couldn't have finished the book 30 years ago, because the ending has a particular release and a particular freedom that wasn't available to me in those early days. So the premise is I turn up at the course, and there's a note on my locker that says my brother can't make it. We were due to play together. So I go out onto the first tee. I think, will I play, won't I play? But that's not a long inner debate. I soon decide that I'm going to play on my own. But on the first tee, there's an Indian gentleman who comes up to me and says, look, I know nothing about this game, but my brother told me about it and I'd be quite interested to walk around. And my first thought is that might be a bit irritating because I'm going to have to teach him about golf and explain a lot of things, and I'd really rather just play. But as it turns out, he ends up, after fairly vigorous conversations between us and some frustration, he ends up teaching me about the inner game of golf, or the inner game of anything in a sense. So I thought I would read just a short excerpt from the middle of the book. So this is chapter 7, and he's been challenging my perception of the game and myself and the world and thinking in all sorts of ways. So this little excerpt is part of that challenge, and comes after I've been talking to him about the game and how I see it. I'm going to read my bit in an English accent and his bit in a fairly poor Indian accent, so apologies for that, but it helps distinguish between who's saying what. So I say, when I'm playing, I'm trying to control my mind, I said. Good luck, he replied with a grin. What do you mean? In Buddhism, it's called monkey mind, jumping from tree to tree. We won't control it. The most we can do is observe the mind and accept how it is, he said. A lot of golfers and other sportsmen and women talk about being or feeling in control. I don't know much about sport, but I do hear many people say they're in control of their lives or want to be. This is an illusion. What do we really control in life? Do you know what will happen tomorrow? As we've been saying, we cannot control our thoughts. But sometimes I feel in control. I suspect these are times when you are in harmony with life, in the flow, as it were. This creates the illusion that we are in charge of what's happening. It's a bit like the little child in the back of the car with a plastic steering wheel. He imagines he's steering. He imagines he's in control. We're really fully part of what's unfolding. It's just that ego thinks it's doing it all. Do you mean I'm not doing it? No, not really. More the opposite. When you get you out of the way, you are more connected to the environment, the space between you and your target, the feel of your club in your hands, the strength of the wind in your favor or against you, the moisture in the atmosphere, the lie of the land. Do you imagine you are in control of these? He asked me. Many years ago, an American president wrote to a Native American Indian chief, asking him to buy some of their land. The chief replied that he could try, but wondered how he would own the hawk that flew across the mountain, or the water that flowed through the river into the sea. So how do you get into the flow? I think what you're describing is what I've heard some sportsmen call being in the zone. Ha, there's a question. I think you call it a paradox. You cannot get into the flow because you are already part of the flow. You are flow. So you can only be what you are by letting go of what you're not. I say. Take the notion of control, for example. If we let go of attempts to control life, we will quite spontaneously be more in harmony with what occurs, like our breathing. We don't need to control our breath. It comes and goes naturally. In fact, maybe like your game of golf. If we think about it too much, we interrupt the flow. So that's a snippet of pretty much an ongoing theme in the book. The theme of ego, of thought, and of a naturalness that can be present if we're not too caught in thought. And the reason that I couldn't finish the book is because when I first started trying to understand meditation and meditated with guides and with teachers, there was at that time a sense of effort, of you need to do this to get here, a sense of effort and progress. So if you meditate enough, you'll be free. If you say your mantra often enough, you'll be free. And on the golf course, if you have a good mindset, if you practice imagining a good outcome, then you'll have the results that you want. And I followed this practice for many years, and there was a lot to it that I found helpful, but ultimately felt very jaded and came to a sort of full stop, which was very challenging because it's something I'd committed to and felt very passionate about for a long time. But it seemed to come to an end. There was an exhaustion to it. And I started looking around for other people to help, particularly for someone perhaps in the mystic tradition who might be able to supervise me as a psychotherapist. And I looked around the UK, particularly for people that might be helpful in that way for the right person. Nothing happened, and a couple of years passed, and I went to a conference in London, which were with the title of Meditation and Mental Health, Mindfulness and Meditation, I think. And there were some interesting talks in the morning. A couple of people presented their research, and there was some interesting research and graphs and PowerPoints, and that was fine. But in the afternoon, there was a French psychiatrist who stood up, and he didn't have any notes, and he didn't have any PowerPoint or research. And he simply stood up and he said, in order to be a psychiatrist, you must completely forget you are a psychiatrist. And then he didn't speak for another 2 minutes, perhaps. And then he said something else, maybe to do with acceptance or peacefulness. And again, there was another 2-minute gap. And this was probably an hour that he spoke. And I say spoke, and I call it a talk, but actually it was more of a meditation, more of a contemplative talk. And that afternoon, I mean, I can pinpoint it as clearly as that. I realized that the stopping that I was experiencing was absolutely needed in terms of the ending of a search for enlightenment or freedom, and that in the very stopping, in the very absence of trying and of identity and of ego, was this freedom. Partly in the content of what Jean-Marc spoke about, and partly in the process of the way he spoke. And it's hard to put into words the impact of that afternoon, but the best we could say is it changed everything. So much so that I wondered whether I could still be a psychotherapist, whether I could still teach meditation, whether I could still be in the same relationships with the same people. There was a radical shift. And to come back to the book, of course, it after a while, once I'd really immersed myself in these teachings and understood them deeply and became a friend and colleague of Jean-Marc, then it was possible to write the ending, and with my wife's help to choose a title. So I started to realize that the absence of the ego, the identity, was the freedom, and was the availability to a wisdom and an understanding that I'd not known before in that form. And it started to make absolute sense in terms of golf as well, because I would play golf with friends and colleagues and they would say, oh, that went really well. I wasn't trying to hit that. Isn't it interesting how far and how well the ball goes when there's no mind, when I'm not thinking about it, when I'm not trying, when I'm not putting effort in. And Jean-Marc has a little phrase which is intention is intention. So I started to realize, and from these conversations with other golfers as well, that tension was interruptive of the results or the freedom to just swing and let the results come. And we can see that. We can see that with the top professionals when someone who's never won a major gets to the top of a leaderboard with 2 or 3 holes to go. You can see and almost feel the tension in their body having an effect. And it's a major challenge to deal with that level of adrenaline, that level of thought that might interrupt the natural flow. So the two seemed absolutely clear to me that these things now came together. So as a therapist or as a mindfulness teacher, there was no one being a therapist, no one teaching. And on the golf course, no one playing. Because if there's just playing, if there's just therapy, then there's no one trying to be a good golfer. There's no one trying to be a good therapist or a wise person or a helpful person. There's simply a pure connection in therapy with the patient or the group, and on the golf course with the environment, with the whole experience of being. Let's say I'm standing 86 yards from the hole, and I've got a wedge, and I want to get that distance right. Well, I'm not going to think that through. I'm not going to think about the velocity of the club head, or how far I take it around here, or anything structural about how hard I hit it. I've got to feel it. I've got to look at that distance and know it in my body, feel the distance in a visceral way. And there again, no one playing, no one thinking, oh, well, I should hit this hard because the wind's against me, or I shouldn't hit it too hard because the wind's behind me, or the green's very fast, so I need to be careful. All the aspects of thinking then become an interruption. And of course, they also become somewhat of that illusion of, that thought did help. So obviously that is the thinking that has helped me here. There's the illusion of control that is in that conversation that I read to you. And I suppose the other influence that I need to mention, because it was such a powerful influence on me as a golfer, but I don't think I fully understood it until these last 10 years or so, was a book called Golf in the Kingdom by Michael Murphy. And in it, he's sort of semi-autobiographical. He's on his way to India, to an ashram, to learn about these things that we're talking about. But on the way, as he's a golfer, he stops in Scotland and meets a mythical golf professional called Shivas Irons, who actually teaches him all the things he's going to learn in India, again via the golf course. And there's one lovely piece that stays with me and still stays with me. I've revisited it recently, where the Michael Murphy character is trying hard to play well in the company of this Shivas and another guy, and he's getting increasingly frustrated. And he sits down next to Shivas in this sort of rather frustrated heap, and Shivas says, "Look, you've got a lovely swing. Just let the nothingness into your swing. Just let the nothingness into your swing." And again, there's the whole philosophy of no one play, or of non-duality, or what we call non-duality. The essence of mindfulness. When we get curious about who's there, who's really there, then actually there's no one there. The creation is in our minds of the I thought, the I identity. It's challenging and it's liberating. And I suppose the motivation in the book, as I was saying to Hugh, is it's like a memoir in a sense, is to share that capacity for freedom with others, to share the possibility of liberation from each of our stories, liberation from the thoughts that trap us, define us, constrict us. And I guess that, it follows on the book I wrote before that. It's called Sitting in the Stillness. It's a collection of stories from the therapy room, where people have experienced that liberation from their stories that have really been for some people, very confining, very inhibiting, because of the I thought, because of the thought that I'm never going to make it. I'm a failure, I'm a disappointment to my family. Very powerful thoughts that we identify with. And there's the problem, not that we have thoughts. We're all going to have thoughts and we're all going to be conditioned by those thoughts. But the freedom is that we don't have to identify them. As the woman said in my meditation group, I now know I'm not my thoughts. And that's freedom. One of the things that attracted me about meditation initially was I thought that I could transcend all my personal traumas and challenges and intense feelings, and that I would just end up smiling rather benignly at the world and be at peace. And it took me a long time to finally realize that peace wasn't something that was separate from these experiences. Peace was like the eye of a storm at the core of these experiences, and there's no bypass to that. We need to revisit these experiences with the intensity that they first arrived, and then know the peace that's beyond and behind that, in a way that we might know the silence that exists behind any noise. I remember running a retreat once, and one of the members was talking about her childhood, which was extremely neglectful and abusive, really difficult stuff. And someone else said, "Oh, you must have been really damaged by that." And she said, no, not at all. I've had a massive amount to deal with on a functional body-mind level. But the soul, the spirit, the being, whatever we call it, was not damaged by that. In the same way that silence isn't damaged by a loud noise. So we absolutely need to attend to these traumas, early traumas. But even with them, not see them as who we are. These days, in a way, silence plays a big part of it. But the basic premise is noticing and accepting, like a mindfulness practice, and within that also returning to the witness, to the observer. So, as in non-duality, not this, not that. So, in Christian terms, that's negation. In Hindi, that's neti. So I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my story, I'm not my patterns of behavior. And as the questioner says, that's the sort of piece that's behind all of that. There's the practice. Now, of course, there's a paradox within non-dual practice, is that we need to really embrace the sort of Zen tradition of the koan, which is there's the practice of no practice. Because as soon as we're starting to practice, then we're into intention, we're into a movement, a step away from what we are. So yes, I do teach meditation, but there's really, we're coming back to being, coming back to presence via the negation, not this, not that, not this, not that. I mean, it's a weird game, isn't it? You're probably in the 3.5 hours of playing, you're actually only swinging playing for a minute and a half. So there's a lot of time in between for thought or anticipation or regret or not being present, in a sense. And yes, you're right. In other sports, and I played a lot of football in my youth, it was very different. You just react to what's going on. You don't have the same time to think. But it's interesting, if we watch, say, a penalty shootout, then other things start to happen. And so then the penalty taker has a bit of time to think about it, and something that they do 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, like hit the target, suddenly they're not hitting the target. Suddenly the thought, what if, it intrudes and something else happens. I'm a big fan of Johnny Wilkinson and his writings, and yeah, he was tortured by what ifs, and the only time he was really at peace and happy was actually on the pitch. And between games, he was filled with anxiety and what ifs. And he talks now very much in non-dual terms about no one there, that absence of that, and the capacity to, like, do a drop kick for the World Cup against Australia that he couldn't have done if he'd thought about what if someone had stopped the game and said, right, this is for the World Cup, on you go, Johnny. He couldn't have done that. It was only the hours of practice and the sort of automatic flow of what he was in that moment that allowed him to do that. I'll read the bit, if you like. So I start off in the locker room. So I say, I found the ball that I wanted to use and had placed it on the bench next to me, balanced on one of its dimples. So for those of you who don't know, the golf ball is round, but it has dimples symmetrically all the way around it. So golf balls had originally been smooth, and it was an accidental discovery that a ball with little indentations travelled more truly to its target. Before that, the old gutta percha ball had been invented by a Scottish golfing reverend who'd ordered a statue of Vishnu, the Hindu god, a statue of Vishnu, the Hindu god, from India. It came wrapped in the rubbery gutta percha substance to protect it. And the good reverend found that he could mould it into a golf ball to supersede the feathery. So the original golf ball was made of leather and with feather inside. Maybe God intervened, and maybe Vishnu too. Before this divine intervention, the golf ball was made of feathers, about a top hatful, stuffed tightly into a small leather pouch and sewn up. This took a while to make and had to be abandoned when they became sodden with water. There was a Christian mystic called Meister Eckhart who taught and wrote in the 13th century. And one of the things he said always stayed with me, which was, if we could really see a tree, we'd never need to go to church again. So if we could really see a tree, we'd never need to go to church again. And of course, what he's referring to, again, we might say this in terms of non-duality and oneness, is that everything is connected, absolutely connected. And golf is a wonderful, for me personally, I know for some people it's a good walk spoiled, but for me it's that opportunity to both be in nature, but also to feel a part of nature, to feel the oneness of an experience of moving my body in relation to the environment. And of course, what Meister Eckhart's talking about in that is that with our language and with our perception, we start to name things, and in the naming of them, we separate. So we call something a tree. Now that's absurd in a sense, because the tree can't be a tree without the space around it, with the earth underneath it, without moisture and light and birds to pollinate. It's actually inaccurate to call it a tree. But if we could really see it in its interconnectedness with the environment and the atmosphere, we'd know God is what Meister Eckhart's saying. And even if you wouldn't call it God, we'd know something of the perfection of nature and the wonder of nature. And I'm glad here that you find that coming across in the book, because it's a passion of mine, and it's something, again, when we let things fall away, the not this and the not that, we realize what we might call true nature, and then we can maybe, on the golf course, in life, in relationships, in intimacy, we can just be ourselves. We can just be true to the loving beings that we are. And then there's a spontaneity about that, a natural connectedness. And of course, what we see when that doesn't happen is human beings separating and seeing themselves as different or better than. God knows what's going to happen after today, but again, examples of what human beings can do to each other when they lose sight of their home, in a sense, their nature. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Well, last year I joined the Shivas Irons Golf Society, which is quite a thriving society based in the States mostly, but international actually, and have given a couple of talks to them about the book, and I hope to be going over there next year, because they have a regular gathering in Oregon around golf, and again, this spirituality and mysticism, mindfulness. So it's a joy, actually. I mean, the context of this, I suppose, going back, is when I first started playing, my father, I was in North London, and my father was a really good golfer. But we were miles apart in terms of our politics and how we viewed the world. And it was 1968, 69 or something, and my hair was down to my shoulders. But no one else in the golf club had hair down to their shoulders apart from the ladies section. They mostly had sports jackets and very right-wing views, alternative to mine. So I'd often felt sort of a bit alone with particularly with the inner game stuff. So reading Michael's book and the inner, Timothy Galway's inner game things, those sorts of things started to make me feel a bit more like I was part of a community interested in these things. And then Shiva Science Society, being part of that, has been great. And I met a guy called Simon Mundy, who used to do Don't Tell Me the Score on BBC, but now does life lessons through sport and beyond. And all his interviews are really about what we can learn from sport, what we can learn from people in sport who've both succeeded, but also those who've had real problems, mental health problems, and come through them. What I've enjoyed about the writing, and I've just had another connection with someone in the States, and we're talking tomorrow, who's a writer but also a golfer. There's something about that that's really drawn me out of a sort of more individual place into a community of people interested in what this is. Someone called it self-inquiry earlier on. Really deeply interested in self-inquiry, and then golf and sport as a means of self-inquiry. I couldn't have wished for more than that, really. It's been a wonderful gift. No, but not on the golf course, but Ram is the character in the book is a mixture of my original teachers, Ken and Elizabeth Mellor, Australian couple, and then more latterly the Jean-Marc Montel, who's my current friend and colleague, who's more in the non-dual tradition. So it's autobiographical in the sense that the teachings and how I've approached the teachings are threaded through the book, as is as you described it earlier on, like a sort of, as is the release at the end into a more peaceful, enjoyable way of playing and living, being. Yes, well, it's I'd never really sort of understood the Zen koan thing. I mean, perhaps it's because the usual description is of what's the sound of one hand clapping sort of thing, and I sort of get that, and but more latterly, I think I've understood it far more deeply in terms of things like what's the path of no path, or what's the practice of no practice. What do we mean by purposeless purpose, for example? And again, if we come back to nature, what is there a purpose in nature? Can we say there's a purpose? But can we say there's no purpose? There seems to be something exquisite and amazing in the balance of nature. But as soon as we go to one sort of binary thing or another, well, it's this, it's purpose or it's purposeless, then we move out of that space that Zen inhabits, which is beautiful. I think it's designed to fuse the mind, to stop it in its sort of binary action. Is it this or is it that? It's both and it's neither. It sounds a nonsense to the Western mind. Surely it's one or the other. No, it's not. It's, as you say, Mushin, no mind is beyond that. It's not one or the other. And there's a deep truth in the practice of no practice. Deep truth in that. No, it's a really good question. Golf is more enjoyable now than it's ever been. It's interesting you ask it, because I've recently got hold of a video of Golf in the Kingdom, and there's a bit where he's practicing letting the nothingness into his swing, which I watched again a few times. And it sort of, it might sound a bit easier than it is to be Mushin, to be no mind, to be out there and free. But actually, ego and mind and a competitiveness, which is, you know, in my blood and in my family, it's often there, and it's still a challenge, but often really a lovely experience to keep letting the nothingness into my swing. And there's so many subtleties within the game as well. So there's a guy, trying to remember his second name now, an American teacher, Fred Shoemaker, yeah, who said, like even watch, you might have a swing thought at the beginning of the swing, and then there might be something else, even in the 1.5 seconds that you're swinging, there might be another thought. So you might start off here with nothingness in your mind, and then another thought here or here or here. And I've noticed how subtle that is, and how pervasive that is, particularly if you've been playing these things a long time. There are certain habits that come in, and there are certain moments in a game. I don't play much competitive golf, but I do compete with my friend who I play with each time, and we do have a healthy competition. So, and I like that in a way, because it keeps me attuned to where my mind is and what happens if I feel like I, you know, need to play better to beat him, or some sort of pressure builds up in the mind. That's good in a way. I like that, because it keeps bringing me back to the nothingness, to the space. And having watched that video about 3 or 4 months ago, it really seemed to help that process again, be there in a way that helped my game, both in terms of the quality of the striking and where the ball was going, and also in enjoyment and the process of playing. No, each hole is an actual hole. And in fact, there's a little bit right at the back of the book where I say, if anyone can guess every hole, they're in England and I think Ireland and Scotland, but each hole is an actual hole. And if anyone can guess, I'll treat them to a round of golf and a pint of beer afterwards. But yes, they're my favourite golf holes. They're particularly challenging holes or beautiful holes. And that Himalaya bunker does exist somewhere else in this country. I'll give you a clue, it's in England, not in Scotland. I think it's a fascinating process, and I'm reading a book at the moment where a guy is talking about, I can't remember his name now actually, but he's talking about Jung's writing about synchronicity or acausal events, and they are absolutely part and parcel of being on this planet and on this earth. And time and time again, I've noticed that. And I think the best example for me was we ran a training course in the NHS for staff. And we didn't know much about the staff, but we knew a fair bit about the patients. So we would match 12 staff with 12 patients for therapy. And we started off matching, you know, by what we knew, what we didn't know, and trying to make the best of fitting this person with this person. But we soon realized that there was something far more powerful at work. And there were all these coincidences happening that seemed to make this patient the right patient for that therapist, and that therapist the right therapist for that patient. And we did it for about 10 years. So there's over 100 times that we were doing that. And just time and time again, there was a meaningful coincidence in who was matched with who. So we ended up not even bothering to think about it, just threw them in the middle and just knew that was going to work. Yeah, I don't know about teachers of golf. I mean, I'd have to mention my dad, because yeah, he was a wonderful golfer, and there's a chapter in there about him. And he, I'm eternally grateful that he taught me this game and taught me the love of the game as well as the game itself. And yes, Jean-Marc, that set me on a path really of immersing myself, particularly in non-dual teachings. So his teacher was Jean Klein, a beautiful teacher of non-duality. And John Klein's teacher, I think, was Ramana Maharshi. So again, these are a lineage of exquisite teachings from mystics. And I've really enjoyed people like Eckhart Tolle, Gangaji, Jeff Foster. There's this, it's a real emergence of these teachings at the moment, and as Tolle calls it, a flowering of consciousness. At the same time as there's all sorts of other things going on in the world, but it's been a great gift to me to find these people. There's an American called John Burney, who's also connected to Adyashanti. There's a number of great teachers out there at the moment, and of course, none of them would say they're great teachers. They're conduits for great teaching. We're just passing on what's infinite and what's been around for thousands of years. There's two strands really. So there's the understanding and the practice, and they're quite important together in a sense, because the practice without the understanding can be challenging. So for example, a practice without the understanding might lead us into an emptiness or a void that is rather frightening or scary. So people might retreat from that without the understanding. So if we have an understanding from the teachings that the emptiness and the void is to be celebrated and welcomed and enjoyed because it's part of that freedom, then we can allow ourselves to practice in that way. And similarly, the understanding without the practice is limited, because it's interesting actually, just before this talk, I was doing some supervision with someone, and he had a major psychological, physical event, a sort of near-death experience really. And he said, I've never felt so alive. And he said, now I get it. Now I really get it. And he said, I've read this stuff for years, and I've studied it, and been to various teachers and things. But in this moment, facing death, then I got it. And that's an example of all the understanding he's brought to it. But we need the actual experience, the lived experience, the practice, and the two go together. So I'd say, yes, read and go to retreats and learn and absorb the teachings, understand them, and then practice. And don't just practice sitting cross-legged in the corner twice a day or whatever. Live the practice. all of it is self-inquiry, all of it. Even golf is self-inquiry, the possibility of liberation. Everyone, bye, take care.